The galaxy had always believed in progress. For millions of cycles, civilizations rose from dust and climbed their way into the stars. Some were ancient beyond comprehension, beings who had witnessed galaxies collide and reform. Others were young, brilliant, and hungry for discovery. Despite their differences, they shared one unshakable belief. Everything could be solved. Or contained. Disease? Eradicated. Entropy? Delayed, studied, perhaps one day conquered. There was always an answer. Until it arrived. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. A distant star system went dark. Not unusual, stars died after all. But this one hadn't been scheduled for collapse for another billion cycles. The anomaly was logged, studied, and eventually dismissed. Then another system vanished. And another. Patterns began to form. Entire sectors of space were going silent, not gradually, but all at once. No distress signals. No survivors. No debris. Just absence. The first expedition sent to investigate never returned. The second transmitted a single fragmented message before it too disappeared. It's not destroying, it's consuming. That was the first time the galaxy heard the name. The swarm. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was already too late. The swarm was not a species in the traditional sense. It had no single form, no homeworld, no central command. It was a shifting mass of biological and mechanical horror, constantly evolving, constantly learning. It didn't conquer. It didn't negotiate. It adapted. Every weapon used against it became useless within moments. Energy shields were bypassed. Kinetic defenses were absorbed. Even experimental weapons, those that bent the laws of physics, worked only once. Then never again. The swarm learned. And it remembered. The first great empire to fall was the Aurelian Concord. They were ancient, older than most civilizations combined. Their technology could manipulate gravity on a planetary scale. Their fleets were said to be invincible. They engaged the swarm with absolute confidence. The battle lasted 17 minutes. Not a single Aurelian vessel survived. Observers from neighboring systems watched in horror as the Concord's shining armada was swallowed whole, ships torn apart, repurposed, and added to the swarm itself. Within days, Aurelian technology began appearing in swarm formations. Improved. Weaponized. Turned against the rest of the galaxy. Panic spread. For the first time in recorded history, the great powers united. The Galactic Council was formed, not as a political alliance, but as a desperate measure for survival. Every species contributed everything they had. Science. Weapons. Knowledge. They studied the swarm relentlessly. Simulated countless scenarios. Developed strategies that, on paper, should have worked. None of them did. Because the swarm was always one step ahead. World after world fell. Some fought until their skies burned. Others surrendered, hoping for mercy. There was none. The swarm didn't care about resistance or submission. To it, all things were resources. Planets were stripped to their cores. Atmospheres consumed. Oceans boiled away into raw material. Even signals were not safe. The swarm learned to track communication patterns, hunting civilizations through the very cries for help they sent into the void. So eventually, the galaxy fell silent. Time passed. No one knew how much. War had become meaningless. There were no victories, only delays. Every battle bought a few more cycles. Every sacrifice postponed the inevitable. The council chambers, once filled with debate and pride, became places of quiet despair. Representatives no longer argued. They simply waited. Waited for reports. Waited for losses. Waited for their turn. It was during one of these sessions that the realization finally came. It wasn't spoken loudly. There were no grand speeches. Just a single statement, delivered with cold, terrifying clarity. We are trying to defeat it like ourselves. Silence followed. Because everyone understood what that meant. Every species in the galaxy fought with logic. With restraint. With rules, spoken or unspoken. Even in war, there were limits. The swarm had none. And that was why it was winning. Another voice, quieter this time, asked the question no one wanted to hear. What if we are not meant to defeat it? A ripple of unease spread through the chamber. What if something else is? They began reviewing records. Not of technology, not of intelligence, but of behavior. They searched for something different, something extreme. A species that did not simply fight wars, but survive them. A species that could endure loss and keep going. One that didn't rely on perfection, but thrived in chaos. The deeper they searched, the more unsettling the results became. There were species that were brutal. Species that were efficient. Species that were relentless. But none of them were enough. None of them matched the swarm's adaptability. None of them embraced destruction the way the swarm did. Until one file appeared. Isolated. Almost overlooked. A blue planet. Orbiting an unremarkable star. A species still divided. Still fighting among itself. Primitive. Unrefined. Dangerous. The Council reviewed their history. Wars that spanned centuries. Conflicts fought not just for survival, but for ideas, beliefs, pride. Weapons that grew more devastating with each generation. And yet, they never stopped. They rebuilt. They adapted. They evolved. One line, buried deep within the report, stood out above all others. Humans do not avoid war. They learn from it. For the first time since the swarm appeared, the Council felt something new. Not hope. Something far more unsettling. Possibility. And with it came a realization that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. They did not need heroes. They needed something worse. The word monster had never been used as praise. Across the galaxy, it was a label reserved for the worst of existence. Unchecked destruction, chaos without reason, violence without restraint. Every civilization had its own history of monsters. And every civilization had spent millennia trying to rise above them. Now, for the first time, they were looking for one. The Galactic Council changed its approach. No longer were they searching for the most advanced species. No longer the most intelligent. No longer the most unified. Those had already failed. Instead, they began searching for something far more dangerous. A species that could match the swarm, not in power, but in nature. Archives were opened. Sealed war records, long buried in the name of progress, were brought back into the light. Histories once considered shameful were now studied with grim fascination. Entire civilizations were re-evaluated, not for their achievements, but for their capacity for destruction. The first candidates seemed promising. The Dravari clans, a warrior species bred in constant conflict. Their entire culture revolved around combat. From birth, they were trained to fight, to endure, to conquer. They had never lost a war. Until they met the swarm. Their fleets charged without hesitation, their strategies flawless, their discipline unmatched. It didn't matter. The swarm adapted within moments. Predictable aggression became a weakness. The Dravari were erased in less than a cycle. Next came the Illith ascendancy. They did not rely on brute force, but on precision, calculated warfare, flawless execution. Every move optimized. Every outcome predicted. They simulated the swarm thousands of times. They believed they had found the solution. Their plan worked. For exactly one battle. Then the swarm changed. Their perfect strategy became obsolete. And perfection could not adapt to failure. The ascendancy fell soon after. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Strength failed. Intelligence failed. Unity failed. Even desperation failed. Because every species shared one critical flaw. They fought to win. The swarm fought to become. It was during the darkest phase of the search that the anomaly appeared. A minor file. Flagged not for importance, but for inconsistency. A developing species from a remote sector. Designation, Sol, 3. Local name, Earth. Dominant species, humanity. At first glance, the file was unimpressive. Technologically behind. Politically fragmented. Environmentally unstable. By every standard the Council had ever used. They were insignificant. And yet, the deeper the Council looked, the more uncomfortable they became. Human history was chaotic. There was no unified path of progress. No steady climb toward enlightenment. Instead, it was a cycle. Conflict. Recovery. Advancement. Then conflict again. They fought each other constantly. Not just for resources, but for ideas. For identity. For things that, to the Council, made no logical sense at all. And yet those conflicts produced something unexpected. Growth. Every war made them stronger. Every disaster forced innovation. Every near-extinction event pushed them forward instead of ending them. Where other species sought stability, humans thrived in instability. The Council began analyzing their wars in detail. Ancient conflicts fought with primitive weapons. Global wars that reshaped their entire civilization. Localized battles driven by nothing more than pride or fear. One pattern became impossible to ignore. Humans adapted faster than they destroyed themselves. Even more disturbing, they learned not only from victory, but from failure. A species would lose millions, and then change tactics mid-conflict. They would turn their own weaknesses into strengths. They would take broken strategies, and rebuild them into something more effective. One council member summarized it in a single line. They weaponize experience. But that wasn't what unsettled them most. It was what humans did after war. They didn't simply rebuild. They remembered. They documented everything, their mistakes, their losses, their horrors. And then they improved upon them. Weapons became more efficient. Strategies became more unpredictable. And perhaps most concerning of all, their tolerance for destruction increased. Not because they desired it, but because they had endured it. The Council observed simulations. Hypothetical scenarios placing humanity against the swarm. At first, the results were the same as every other species. Defeat. Extinction. Failure. But then something changed. When allowed to continue beyond initial loss, humanity's behavior shifted. They stopped fighting conventionally. They abandoned predictable patterns. They began experimenting, sacrificing, adapting. In some simulations, they even used the swarm against itself. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively. For the first time since the swarm had appeared, there were outcomes where it did not win. The council chamber fell into silence. One representative finally spoke, their voice barely steady. They are not stronger than us. Another responded, they don't need to be. A third added more quietly, they are closer to the swarm than we are. That statement lingered, because it was true. Humanity was not the most advanced species, not the most unified, not the most powerful, but they were something else entirely. They were unpredictable, resilient, creative, and if necessary, ruthless. The council hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of fear, because choosing humanity meant accepting a terrifying possibility. If they could defeat the swarm, what would they become afterward? The vote was called. For the first time in history, it was unanimous. No debate, no opposition, no delay. The decision echoed across the chamber. Deploy humanity. And in that moment, the fate of the galaxy was sealed, not by the swarm, but by the monsters they had chosen to fight it. Humanity had always believed that if aliens existed, they would come as conquerors, or explorers, or gods. They were wrong. The first ships appeared without warning. No dramatic entry. No invasion fleets blotting out the sky. Just presence. They emerged silently at the edge of Earth's orbit, vast, impossible structures that seemed less like machines and more like controlled fragments of space itself. Every satellite detected them. Every government tracked them. Every military prepared for the worst. Weapons were armed. Missiles were primed. Fingers hovered over buttons that could end the world. Humanity held its breath. And then, the message came. Not in any known language. Not in sound. But directly into every system capable of receiving data. Screens flickered across the planet. Phones. Computers. Military networks. Even outdated machines long thought disconnected. One message. Simple. Translated instantly. We request your help. Confusion spread faster than fear. This wasn't how first contact was supposed to go. No demands. No threats. No display of power. Just a request. Governments hesitated. Scientists scrambled. Military leaders argued. Was this a trick? A test? A prelude to invasion? Then the second message arrived. It showed them everything. Entire star systems collapsing into silence. Planets stripped bare in moments. Fleets, vast, powerful, advanced beyond anything humanity had ever imagined, being torn apart like fragile debris. And at the center of it all, something alive. Shifting. Growing. Adapting. The swarm. For the first time in human history, every nation, every leader, every soldier saw the same thing at the same time. No filters. No interpretation. No denial. Just truth. And it was worse than anything they could have imagined. Panic should have followed. Mass hysteria. Breakdown. But it didn't. There was silence. A long, heavy silence. Because humanity understood something immediately that the Council had taken cycles to realize. This wasn't a war they could avoid. It was already coming. The third message arrived shortly after. All others have failed. The pause. You will not. That assumption alone sparked anger. Debate erupted across every level of human society. Why them? Why Earth? Why? Some demanded resistance. Others argued for cooperation. Many simply didn't believe it. Until the final transmission came. A projection. A simulation. A future. Earth consumed. Oceans gone. Atmosphere stripped. Cities erased without a trace. Humanity didn't just watch its possible extinction. It watched how quickly it would happen. Less than a day. That was all the swarm would need. The debates ended. Emergency summits were held. Global communication lines opened. Decisions that once took years were made in hours. And eventually, a single response was prepared. Not from one nation. Not from one leader. But from humanity itself. The message was simple. What do you want us to do? For the first time, the alien vessels responded in real time. A new stream of data flooded Earth systems. Ship designs. Weapon schematics. Biological analyses of the swarm. Centuries of knowledge, compressed and delivered in seconds. And with it, a directive. Fight. No instructions. No limitations. No rules. Just one expectation. Human military leaders studied the data. Scientists analyzed the swarm structure. Strategists ran simulations. The results were unanimous. They couldn't win. Not with current technology. Not with current understanding. Not with anything they had. And yet, that wasn't the question humanity asked. Instead, one question began appearing again and again across every analysis, every discussion, every plan. Can it be hurt? Not defeated. Not destroyed. Because if it could be hurt, it could be studied. If it could be studied, it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could be beaten. The Council watched closely. They expected hesitation. Perhaps even refusal. They saw something they hadn't anticipated. Excitement. Not everywhere. Not in everyone. But enough. Enough to matter. Humans began preparing immediately. Shipyards accelerated. Weapons were redesigned overnight. Old theories, once considered too dangerous, were revisited. Nothing was off-limits. For the first time in their history, humanity wasn't preparing for war against itself. It was preparing for something else. Something bigger. Something worse. And unlike every other species before them, they didn't ask if they could win. They asked how far they were willing to go. The answer came quickly. Farther than anyone else ever had. The Council observed in growing unease. Because they were beginning to understand something they hadn't before. They had not chosen humanity because it was the strongest, or the smartest, or even the most capable. They had chosen humanity because it was willing to adapt, willing to sacrifice, willing to become whatever was necessary. Even if that meant becoming something unrecognizable. As Earth's first fleet prepared to leave its home system, A final transmission was sent to the council. Unfiltered. Purely human. We don't know if we can win. The pause. But we've fought worse than ourselves before. And then, after a moment, this won't be any different. The fleet jumped. And for the first time since the swarm had appeared, something new entered the war. Not hope. Not certainty. But something far more dangerous. Humanity. The first human fleet didn't win. It wasn't supposed to. They entered the war the same way every other species had. With strategy. With formation. With purpose. And like every other species, they were destroyed. The swarm met them at the edge of a dead system. What had once been a thriving civilization was now nothing more than scattered debris and a dim, fading star. A graveyard. Human ships formed ranks. Weapons locked. Commands issued. They fought well. Missiles struck with precision. Energy weapons carved through swarm biomass. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it looked like it might work. Then the swarm adapted. It always did. Human targeting systems began failing. Shield frequencies were bypassed. New swarm forms emerged mid-battle, designed specifically to counter human weapons. Within minutes, the fleet began to fall. Ships vanished in bursts of light and silence. Communications broke into fragments. Orders became chaos. And then, nothing. The first human fleet was gone. The council watched in silence. They had seen this before. Too many times. Another species. Another failure. But something was different. Because humanity didn't stop. The second fleet arrived before the wreckage of the first had even gone cold. No hesitation. No delay. And this time, they fought differently. Their formations were looser. Less predictable. Their weapons modified. Some were experimental. Others were reckless. They didn't rely on a single strategy. They used many. All at once. Some ships engaged directly. Others held back. Some acted as bait. And when the swarm adapted, humans adapted faster. They changed tactics mid-battle. Abandoned failing strategies without hesitation. Turned retreat into ambush. It wasn't clean. It wasn't efficient. But for the first time, the swarm slowed. The council noticed immediately. A delay. A hesitation. Insignificant by most standards. But unprecedented. Then came the third fleet. It didn't arrive as a fleet. It arrived as something else. Fragments. Independent units. Ships operating alone, or in small, unpredictable groups. No central command. No unified formation. Chaos. The council was horrified. This wasn't war. This was disorder. But the swarm struggled. Because for the first time, it couldn't predict what was happening. Human ships acted without pattern. Without consistency. Without logic the swarm could easily learn. They made mistakes. And then, they used those mistakes. Ships would intentionally expose weaknesses, only to detonate when the swarm closed in. Others transmitted false data, tricking the swarm into adapting to threats that didn't exist. Some even allowed themselves to be partially consumed, just to deliver weapons from the inside. The losses were catastrophic. Entire fleets disappeared. Millions of lives gone. And yet, humanity kept going. Because they weren't trying to win battles anymore. They were learning. Every encounter was data. Every failure was progress. Every loss a step forward. The council began to understand the truth. Humanity wasn't fighting the swarm like an enemy. They were fighting it like a problem. And problems could be solved. Then something happened that no one had thought possible. In a distant system, far from the core of the conflict, a human fleet held its ground. Not for minutes. Not for moments. For hours. The swarm attacked. Adapted. Evolved. And so, the humans held. Not because they were stronger, but because they refused to stop changing. By the end of the battle, the swarm withdrew. Not destroyed, but retreating. The first retreat in its history. The galaxy felt it. A shift. Fragile, but real. Hope began to return. And with it, fear. Because the more the council observed humanity, the less they understood them. Human strategies became darker, more extreme. They began using weapons once considered unthinkable. Biological agents designed to infect the swarm's adaptive systems. Self-replicating code that spread through its structures. Even gravitational distortions that collapsed entire regions of space, taking both the swarm and human forces with them. There were no limits anymore. No rules. No hesitation. Only results. And it worked. Slowly. Painfully. But undeniably. The swarm was changing. Not just adapting. Struggling. For the first time, it was reacting. The council gathered again. Not in despair this time, but in something far more uneasy. Realization. One representative spoke, their voice unsteady. They are becoming like it. Another responded. No, they're becoming worse. Silence followed. Because no one could deny it. Humanity was succeeding. But not by remaining what they were. They were evolving. Not physically, but mentally, strategically, morally. The lines that once defined them were disappearing. And in their place, something new was forming. Something the galaxy had never seen before. Something the Council had unknowingly created. The war wasn't just changing. Humanity was. The war did not end with a victory. There was no final battle. No single moment where the galaxy could say, "It is over." The swarm began to disappear. At first, no one noticed. A system once under attack went quiet. Another up untouched. Then another. No signals. No movement. No presence. The swarm wasn't advancing anymore. It was retreating. The Council struggled to understand. They had prepared for extinction. For sacrifice. For a war without end. But not for this. Reports flooded in. Human fleets pushing deeper into swarm territory. Not holding lines. Not defending systems. Hunting. That was the word that began appearing in every transmission. Humanity wasn't fighting anymore. It was chasing. Tracking the swarm across dead systems and shattered space. Following its movements. Anticipating its adaptations. And countering them before they happened. Entire swarm clusters vanished without explanation. No debris. No trace. Just gone. The Council demanded answers. What they received only made things worse. Human battle reports were no longer recognizable as war logs. They read like something else. Experiments. Cold. Precise. Unsettling. They detailed controlled engagements, testing swarm reactions to new forms of attack. Deliberate losses to observe adaptive patterns. Calculated sacrifices measured not in lives, but in outcomes. One report ended with a line that echoed across the council chamber. Subject failed to adapt within expected parameters. Not enemy. Not threat. The council began to understand. Humanity hadn't just learned how to fight the swarm. They had learned how to control the war itself. And in doing so, they had changed the rules entirely. The final confirmed encounter came from the edge of the galaxy. A human fleet, if it could still be called that, intercepted what appeared to be the last major concentration of the swarm. The council watched the transmission in silence. There was no formation, no structure, just human vessels surrounding the swarm mass from every direction. No attack was launched. They waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. The swarm moved. Shifted, adapted, but nothing happened, because there was nothing to adapt to. For the first time, the swarm was facing something it could not understand. Uncertainty. Then, without warning, the humans struck. Not with overwhelming force. Not with a single weapon. But with everything. Simultaneously. Energy. Kinetics. Biological agents. Gravitational collapse. Signal disruption. Every method humanity had developed, every strategy they had learned, every sacrifice they had made, all unleashed at once. The swarm tried to adapt. It always did. But this time, it couldn't keep up. Too many variables. Too many changes. Too many unknowns. For the first time since its existence began, the swarm failed. It didn't retreat. It didn't evolve. It broke. The transmission ended in silence. And when sensors cleared, there was nothing left. No swarm. Anywhere. The war was over. The galaxy was saved. But no one celebrated. Because the humans didn't return. Not immediately. Their fleets remained in the outer regions. Moving. Patrolling. Watching. As if they were waiting for something. Or someone. The council called for a final assembly. For the first time since the war began, all remaining civilizations were present. Not in fear of the swarm, but in fear of something else. Humanity. The question was simple. What are they now? No one had an answer. Because the beings who had entered the war were not the same ones who remained. They had crossed a line. Not out of desperation, but by choice. They had embraced what the galaxy had always rejected. Adaptation without limits. War without rules. Survival at any cost. They had become exactly what the council had searched for. Monsters. A final transmission arrived. Not from a fleet, but from humanity itself. Unmistakably human. The threat is gone. The pause. We will remain, in case it returns. The council hesitated. Then one representative asked the question no one could ignore. And if it doesn't? For a long moment, there was no response. Then we'll make sure nothing like it ever rises again. Silence filled the chamber. Because they understood what that meant. Not protection. Not defense. Control. The galaxy had been saved. But at a cost no one had truly considered. Because when they had searched for monsters, they hadn't just found one. They had created something far more dangerous. Something that didn't just survive war, but mastered it. And as the council looked out into the stars, now quiet, now safe, they realized the truth too late. The swarm had been a force of nature, but humanity was a choice. And that made them far more terrifying. Because when the galaxy needed monsters, they found humanity.